You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Yeah, they've got the impossible job of trying to satisfy people who are at war, right? Or at least to be seen as trying to look out for the interests both of their enslavers and the enslaved people below them. And so it's this constant balancing act where they're choosing from a range of bad options and having to kind of decide which side of that struggle they're going to come down on really throughout every individual day.
Hello, and welcome to episode 418 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. We often learn about slavery in early America through broad economic or political terms. Terms like cotton, sugar, markets, or even revolutions. But what happens when we turn our focus to the lived experiences of enslaved people themselves? What did slavery look and feel like on the ground? What did survival look like day to day? And what do we make of the enslaved people who were forced into positions of authority over others, like the plantation drivers who were tasked with extracting labor from their fellow enslaved workers? Randy Brown is an award-winning historian and a professor of history at Xavier University. He's also the author of The Driver's Story, Labor and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery. Randy is a specialist in the history of the Atlantic slave trade and the African diaspora, and today he joins us to investigate the driving system of plantation slavery. Now, during our conversation, Randy reveals how the labor regime of plantation slavery developed and how it functioned from the bottom up, especially through the system of enslaved drivers. Why enslavers placed such high demands and often brutal expectations on drivers to control and punish their fellow enslaved people, and how drivers negotiated impossible choices as they tried to survive within and sometimes subvert a system designed to dehumanize them. Our conversation today is about power, survival, and the terrible moral weight enslaved people carried within a violent system that was not of their choosing. We'll be approaching today's topic with care and from a belief that enslaved people were more than just laborers or property. They were human beings who exercised agency, made decisions under duress, and left behind histories worth honoring. But before we turn to this conversation, I want to take a moment to thank you. Yes, you, because curious minds like yours are the reason that Ben Franklin's World exists. This show is listener-powered, and your support makes all the difference. So if you enjoy exploring early American history with us, and you'd like to keep this podcast going strong as an independent production, please consider making a donation. Every contribution helps me, Joe, and Karen continue to bring thoughtful, accessible history to listeners just like you all around the world. And it's easy to make a tax-deductible donation. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And if you've already donated, thank you. Your generosity fuels this work, and we just couldn't do this without you. So thank you for making this podcast possible. Okay, are you ready to explore the world of plantation slavery and its driving system? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a professor of history at Xavier University. He's a specialist in the history of the Atlantic slave trade in the British Caribbean and teaches courses on the African diaspora, slave rebellions, the transatlantic slave trade, and colonial North America. He's published 2 books on these subjects, including Surviving Slavery in the British Caribbean and, most recently, The Driver's Story, Labor and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Randy Brown.
Thanks, Liz. I'm happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you, Randy. Now, your book, The Driver's Story, sets out to answer one of the most enduring questions in the study of Atlantic slavery. How did enslavers manage to extract so much labor from the people they enslaved in the face of their relentless resistance? Randy, before we try to answer that big question, would you help us understand slavery in the broader Atlantic world? In recent years, it has seemed to me like historians have viewed slavery mostly in economic terms. And mainly I mean by that in terms of the economics of labor, the Atlantic trade, and plantation management. So would you tell us why historians have turned their attention to the economics of slavery or the business side of slavery, and remind us how they studied slavery before they turned to those economics?
Sure. And you're absolutely right that there's been a lot of work in recent years on what we might think of as broadly the economic history of slavery and of the slave trade. And I think it's important to know how slavery worked as a business. But I've got to say, my main interest has really always been on the experiences of enslaved people themselves, rather than kind of how the system worked as a whole. And in this book, what I'm trying to do is focus on drivers to look at the labor regime of Atlantic slavery from the bottom up, to try to see what that meant for enslaved people themselves and their day-to-day lives. Drivers were enslaved people, usually men, who were appointed by white plantation authorities to supervise, manage, and punish other enslaved people. And that role trapped them between the insatiable demands of planters and the constant resistance of other enslaved laborers, essentially putting them at what the historian Vincent Brown has described as a never-ending war between the enslavers and the enslaved. And so for me, to better understand that struggle, I decided to focus on a series of questions about drivers' predicament, their motivations, their struggles. I wanted to know what strategies they developed to try to balance the competing pressures from above and below, to understand why anyone would want to be a driver in the first place, to see how maybe African ideas about leadership and family life might have shaped the way drivers understood their social role in the slave community, and finally to see what roles drivers played in resistance to slavery, including slave rebellions. So for me, this was a book to try to kind of zoom in on the day-to-day lived experience of this kind of wider economic system, rather than look at it from a sort of kind of panoramic or macroeconomic view.
And how have other scholars within the field viewed slavery? Do they view it like you in terms of individual experiences within the institution of slavery, or are they really mostly interested in the economics of this system of labor?
That's a hard question to answer. It's a good question, but the field of slavery studies has, for decades, long before I was alive even, been full of all these debates about exactly what perspectives we should center. And I think we're continuing to see that right now. There continues to be microhistorical and biographical approaches to look at individual people and events. At the same time, there are these massive, sometimes quantitative data sets. Think of something like the Slave Voyages, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. And I think we're really at a moment where we're continuing to debate the advantages and disadvantages of these two different approaches. I don't think I should say it's a either or question. I think we can learn from and ideally integrate the approaches and insights of these different ways of studying slavery.
Now, like other scholars before you point to 17th century Barbados as the origin time and place for the brutal form of plantation slavery that we've read and heard about in the Caribbean and on southern plantations in the British American colonies turned United States. What was slavery like in early Barbados, and how did that early form of slavery transform into the brutal plantation system that we hear about and read about?
Yeah, Barbados is so important for the history of slavery in the Americas, the development of plantations. For me, in this book, one of the things I was trying to do was trace the origins of what enslavers called the driving system and the role of the driver itself. And all signs pointed me to 17th century Barbados. Starting in the 1640s, Barbados experienced a so-called sugar revolution, where struggling English planters, farmers really, shifted from a mixed economy, crops that weren't doing well, things like tobacco, in the face of competition from Chesapeake, actually, to the incredibly lucrative production of sugar. They, along the way, gradually moved away from a labor force that was made up mostly of white indentured servants and relied more and more on the transatlantic slave trade. And eventually, enslaved Africans became a demographic majority on the island. One of the things that happened during this transition was that English planters made some major innovations to the way sugar was produced. That included building their own mills to process sugar on the same plantations where it was grown. And you might think, well, how else was it done previously? And this is something you see in the early Brazilian sugar industry, for example. The growing and manufacturing processes took place in different locations by enslaved labor forces working under different management and owners. In Barbados, instead, you have these new, what they called integrated plantations. And one thing that they relied on was a much larger labor force, usually 100 or more enslaved workers. And to manage these larger labor forces, enslavers developed a new method of labor organization that they called the gang system. That's where enslaved field laborers were divided into multiple work units or gangs who they put under the direct supervision, not of white plantation employees like overseers, but of enslaved supervisors who came to be known as drivers.
Was there something unique or special about Barbados and its colonists that they were the ones to develop and innovate with this driving system of slavery? Because France, Spain, and the Netherlands also claimed colonial islands that had slavery that practiced slave labor systems. But it was the English system in Barbados that developed into this style of plantation slavery that colonies, even in these other countries or claimed by these other countries, would adopt. So why did the gang and driver system of slavery develop in Barbados and not in some other colony?
There are some precedents for using enslaved supervisors in other places. And I should say that trying to figure out the real origin of the driving system and its early evolution is really difficult because the sources that we have from the earliest periods of slavery and sugar production in the Americas are so limited. There are some models that planters in Barbados seem to be borrowing from. I mean, one example from earlier colonial Brazil is a figure who's known as the sugar master. This is a sort of foreman who's in charge of the boiling house. The Royal African Company also used a figure known as a guardian on slave ships during the transatlantic slave trade, but it does seem like the position of the driver itself was something created in Barbados. It was an innovation from English planters. The earliest clear reference I found to drivers is actually from one of the earliest set of instructions we have about plantation management. It's a 1679 letter, so just a couple decades into the Sugar Revolution. It's a planter named Henry Drax who had moved back to England, and he's explaining how he wants his plantation managed. And one of the things he does in this letter is mention an enslaved man by name, and he calls him a head overseer. Then a couple decades later, we see the term driver itself becoming more and more common in other writing. And so it really seems to be the position tied to this gang system, which I should say starts in Barbados, but then gets adopted and borrowed by planters working in all kinds of other plantation systems, not just in the Caribbean and not just sugar.
Now, before we dive into the driver system and how it can offer us an intimate or personal view of enslaved experiences, I'd like to talk about the sources you used. Randy, many scholars have tried to understand slavery at a personal level. They've tried to understand what the system's brutality meant for the individual enslaved people who experienced it. But everyone who has tried to look at slavery in this personal way has confronted a problem of historical sources. So what kinds of historical sources did you use, and what challenges did you face in your research of slave drivers as you tried to uncover how they experienced slavery?
You're right that all historians of slavery confront this basic problem of the archive, where, frankly, most of the sources that we have don't let us get to a lot of the questions, things we'd most want to know. At the same time, I was determined to get as close as possible in this book to the lived experiences of drivers and other enslaved people. And so I looked at essentially everything I could find, a wide range of sources and archives and libraries, digitized sources in the US and the Caribbean and Europe, everything that you might think of in terms of kind of classic sources for the study of slavery, planters' diaries, plantation management, manuals, letters from missionaries and abolitionist propaganda, slave narratives. But pretty quickly, I decided to concentrate on an unusually rich archive from the British Caribbean during the early 19th century. So this is a couple centuries after, really, a century and a half or two after the Sugar Revolution we were talking about a minute ago. This was a period of imperial reform known as amelioration. And one of the key things that happened in this era was that enslaved people in certain British colonies, not all, British Guiana, Trinidad, and St. Lucia, were given new legal protections and new legal rights, including the right to seek redress by going to colonial officials who were known as fiscals or protectors of slaves. And one of the key things those officials did was record extensive first-person, sometimes verbatim testimony from the people who appeared before them. And so we have this archive of thousands of enslaved people speaking, including what I found hundreds of drivers. Now, this is still an archive of mediated sources. It's full of gaps and silences and distortions. It's not perfect. We don't get transparent representations of what actually happened. But in my view, it gives us an unusually raw, intimate view of the driving system, where we actually see some version of the voices and perspectives of enslaved people themselves in one of the largest slave systems in the Americas. Now, it's one thing to think about the driver's predicament in the abstract, or to see that through the lens of planters' kind of idealized view of what a driver did. It's a whole other thing to read agonizing testimony from a driver describe what it felt like to be flogged for not getting the gang he supervised to cut quite as much sugarcane as the owner demanded, or to read a complaint from an enslaved woman who's 5 months pregnant and couldn't keep up with the pace of work, only to have a driver beat and kick her so that she miscarried. And so these are the kind of glimpses of drivers' lives we get from this archive, and that's why I chose to spend so much time on it.
It sounds like you experienced another problem that many historians of early America face, which is you needed to visit numerous archives around the Atlantic world, in Europe, the Caribbean, and the United States, which sounds really glamorous, but it's actually a lot of work. So I wonder if you could discuss the types of sources that you found in these different archives and how you approach them. You just mentioned that you used a lot of sources from the British fiscals who were employed to keep track of the problems created by slavery, which forced them to conduct a lot of different interviews with enslaved people who discussed their concerns and issues on different plantations. So how were you able to get at the voices and experiences of slave drivers when their interviews were mediated and written down by these white fiscals, who you mentioned in the driver's story often truncated and modified what enslaved people told them?
It's key to remember the context in which this archive is produced. There's a way that enslaved people, when they're going to complain, have a kind of narrow range of options. They know that they can only complain about things that would be an actual violation of the law. So, for example, I was flogged beyond the legal limit. I was given too many lashes. Or I was worked on a day or a time that I wasn't supposed to legally work. And so there's already a way that the legal protections people have, which have to do with working conditions, which have to do with punishment, shape the types of stories people end up telling. Even then, there are kind of ways where people end up discussing things that, maybe they shouldn't have or don't seem relevant. And I found those especially revealing. Now, that's not what the legal authorities are really interested in. They're reading these cases very differently than I am. They're trying to figure out, was a law violated? And if so, what sort of punishment, if any, should plantation manager be fined? Is this person telling the truth? One thing I was struck by was the kind of construction of a moral economy, where even under these dire conditions, everyone is trying to set some limit on the physical violence they're willing to tolerate, to establish some standard of what seemed like a reasonable workload or what was entirely unreasonable. There are also major gaps in these. I mean, one thing that I found in these sources is an almost near total absence of female drivers. And that was really revealing. It led me to look to other kinds of evidence. And I knew from other sources that enslaved women played an important role as drivers. There were not nearly as many women as men who were drivers, but especially in terms of supervising what was known as the children's gang. These are enslaved children entering their first working years. They don't show up in this archive. And I found literally 2 or 3 enslaved women out of these thousands of complaints involving drivers. So that's kind of one specific example of a gap or a silence that we don't see in these records.
Well, let's dive into the driving system. Randy, you told us that this system of labor developed in Barbados, but how did it actually work? Would you give us a detailed account of what the driving system was and how it worked on the ground?
At the most basic level, it was a mode of labor organization. You would see this primarily on large plantations. And it meant that enslaved people were working under the direct supervision of enslaved supervisors, drivers, not plantation overseers or managers would be above the drivers. As you noted, it became common, associated with Caribbean sugar plantation, but eventually became common throughout plantation societies. If you take a typical plantation in the Caribbean, though, you might have anywhere between 100 and, say, 300 people, and they'd be divided into 3 basic gangs. These gangs were composed of people who had more or less the same age, physical condition, and perceived labor capacity, because one of the things that the gang system was supposed to do was to set a collective pace where everyone worked at the same rhythm. Each of those gangs, in turn, would have been supervised by 1 or more drivers. So your first gang, you'd have the most able adults who did the hardest physical labor, like digging holes to plant sugarcane. That would have been supervised by the head driver, the most senior driver on the plantation. Your more junior drivers, sometimes called second drivers or under drivers, would supervise the second and third gang. And then there was an additional gang, sometimes called the children's gang or the grass gang, where children as young as 6 years old worked under the supervision of female drivers. These were usually elderly women who had been kind of retired from field work. They weren't physically capable of doing the hardest field tasks. At the same time, you had a whole range of supervisory positions outside of the field where people who were assigned to trade work, like carpenters or masons, or people who worked in the boiling house or the distillery, would work under drivers or other enslaved supervisors who were sometimes known as heads. And so the key point is that if you were an enslaved laborer on a large plantation in the Americas, the person most likely supervising your work directly for making sure that you stayed at the same task, that you finished it, that the work was performed to a certain standard would have been another enslaved person, would have been the driver. That would also be the person you would go to try to renegotiate labor expectations, to ask perhaps that they might advocate for you by trying to get a bit more food or a little more time to rest. And the driver was also the person who was in charge of directly punishing you.
That's really interesting because I think in our historical imaginations, we tend to picture enslaved people out in the plantation fields doing whatever agricultural work needed to be done, but they're under the supervision of white overseers. When we tend to look for supervisors out in the field, in our imagination, we see white people. But what your research indicates is that no, in fact, the majority of field supervisors supervising this labor were actually other enslaved people.
That's absolutely true on these larger plantations. Now, in a smaller slaveholding, so if you think like of people working on a farm in New England, for example, or even your smaller kind of mixed farms in the Chesapeake, not your very large tobacco plantations, we're not talking places like Mount Vernon either, you would have people working under direct supervision of their enslavers. But yeah, by and large, most people working on large plantations would have been working under a series of other enslaved people, and then a complex hierarchy of white authorities from overseer to manager, maybe a resident planter, often an absentee planter in Europe above them. So it is a more complex hierarchy, I think, than we sometimes imagine.
It also begs the question of how and why white enslavers were able to trust these enslaved overseers to keep their plantations productive and running. So how did white enslavers develop this kind of trust in their enslaved workforce?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, though. I would push back. I don't think trust is maybe the right word here. Now, planters absolutely relied on drivers. In pretty much every plantation manual I read, they were surprisingly candid about just how much they depended upon drivers. I remember one planter from Jamaica describes the driver as the life and soul of the estate. And they clearly saw the driver as the key to labor coercion, labor extraction, and their own security and safety even. But white plantation authorities were relentless in surveilling drivers, in punishing them for any perceived faults. Drivers had to constantly be coerced into doing the job that their enslavers wanted. One example of what this looks like in practice is something called the tally stick. This was a little wooden stick where drivers carried it into the field and they made little notches as a certain quantity of labor got done. They finished a particular row, they got another bushel of sugarcane loaded, and then they would have to take these tally sticks and then show them to the overseers or managers above them. And if those tally sticks indicated that drivers were falling short, that the people under them weren't being pushed to work hard enough or fast enough, then drivers would often be humiliated. They'd be yelled at. They'd often be whipped. Sometimes they'd even be demoted. And so that's just one example of the kind of surveillance and pressure drivers are under. I found that drivers were trapped essentially in the same violent system of labor coercion that other enslaved people would. The other thing I'd say is that there are plenty of ways that drivers pushed back and resisted their enslavers, resisted the labor regime, which I'd be happy to talk about.
That would be great, but let us first talk about who worked as drivers. And actually, since we seem to be at a moment of transition, let's take a quick moment to thank our episode sponsor. If Ben Franklin's World has deepened your understanding of early America or sparked your curiosity, please consider supporting the show. We're now independently produced by Clio Digital Media, a small nonprofit I co-founded with fellow historians Joe Edelman and Karen Wolf. There's no big institution behind us. We're just a team of 3 historians with our deep love of history. Your donation is tax deductible and directly supports creation of new episodes, expert conversations, and the kind of trustworthy history that you value. If every listener gave just $5, we'd be fully funded for the year. So please visit benfranklinsworld.com/donate to make your gift. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Thank you so much for your support and for being a part of our story. Randy, drivers seem to sit at the heart of the driving system. So who did white enslavers imagine would serve as drivers? You mentioned that both men and women could work as drivers, But did enslaved men and women desire to become drivers and seemingly move up within the driving system ranks?
Yeah, and I think the key here is to remember the context in which everyone's working. When we talk about someone who would want to be a driver, would see this position as preferable to being a field laborer, we got to remember that, especially in the Caribbean, plantations were death traps. Most people knew that they had no real chance of becoming free, of escaping the plantation. And so what I found, I mean, this is something I argued in my first book, is that most people were focused on trying to find ways to get by and to survive. And what I think was obvious to them, and I certainly found in my research, is that one of the best strategies for surviving, for prolonging your life, was to become a driver. And that's because the position came with some really important practical or material advantages, starting with the fact that drivers didn't have to do the same field work. The physical toll that field work took on people was really incredible. Drivers also got better clothing, they had more secure housing, and maybe most importantly, they got food, much better qualities than other enslaved people. Now, these were some of the main incentives enslavers offered the people that they appointed as drivers, and they might seem sort of insignificant, but in a world where people were living very literally on the brink of death, collectively, these marginal advantages had a huge impact on the quality of drivers' lives. I found that while field laborers usually died by their early 40s, drivers often lived into their late 50s or 60s. The other main advantage or marginal advantage of becoming a driver had to do with the social benefits that came with the position. And you see this in drivers' unusual success in building families, sometimes remarkably large families. Now, in most Caribbean plantation societies, enslaved men found it really hard to establish any sort of long-term relationships with enslaved women. Part of the problem was simply demographic. In societies that relied on the transatlantic slave trade, there were many more enslaved men than there were women. Now, drivers stood out here. They were much more likely than other men to be married, to have children, and even more strikingly, drivers often had multiple wives. This was something that African men aspired to do, but something that most of them never managed to do in the Caribbean. And so it seems that becoming a driver was not only a social or a survival strategy, but also was a way of resisting the threat of social death. In terms of who planners wanted as a driver, the main thing that they were looking for is someone that they felt, back to your early question, that they could more or less trust, someone who had proved themselves to be responsible. They highlighted a couple particular qualities. They are generally talking about men, their kind of idea of a driver. They go quickly to their idea of a head driver, which is not for them as they sought a position for women. They thought the driver had to be someone who was a skilled laborer themselves, and so they'd pick someone usually who had worked in field labor for several years or several decades. The other main quality they looked for in drivers, I find this even more revealing, they talked about candidates for the position of driver as someone who had broad respect within the slave community, someone who was seen as an authority. They couldn't just appoint someone who was widely feared or hated. They really worked to find someone who was already recognized as a leader among enslaved people. I found that very revealing.
One of the things that struck me as I read Randy's book, The Driver's Story, was how the material conditions that enslaved people lived under could improve if they became drivers. Randy, could you talk to us about the food and clothing that enslaved people received and how that food and clothing allotment might improve if they became a driver?
Yeah, enslavers understandably were trying to give people the bare minimum that they could. They were obsessed with maximizing profits. They really cared nothing about the human toll that plantation labor took on enslaved people. Your recently arrived African captives would survive the so-called seasoning period of adjustment to the work regime, to new disease environment, usually for just a few years. And then if they did survive that, field laborers are sick something like half of the time. Part of the reason why is they're really barely meeting their basic nutritional needs. They're working, despite the kind of idealized images we sometimes see in illustrations, enslaved people were working essentially naked or near naked in the field. Drivers really stood out. Drivers were given larger rations or so-called allowances of clothing. They were given much larger rations of food. You see this from that very first plantation, that set of instructions I mentioned from Henry Drax in Barbados, where he says, hey, my head overseer, essentially the driver, enslaved overseer, he needs to get double the quantity of salt fish. This was the primary protein staple for enslaved people in the Caribbean, double what other people get. Drivers would often have shoes, they'd have a coat, they'd have much better clothing. And so these material advantages made them, it's hard to kind of describe this in a way that's satisfying. They're materially much better off than other enslaved people. This let them essentially live longer, healthier lives than pretty much anyone else on the plantation.
Another aspect of the driving system that struck me as I read the driver's story is how women and women drivers really underpinned the driving system. Because the work of enslaved women was really to educate children and newly informed enslaved people about how to do the labor that was expected of them. Randy, would you tell us more about the work of women drivers and the type of driving work they performed as compared with their male counterparts?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that because I think for all kinds of reasons, our popular image of who the driver was is that it was an enslaved man. And honestly, at first glance, most of the evidence that survives suggests that at least when it came to managing adult field laborers, the driver who would supervise first or second gang, that this was an exclusively male occupation. One of the best sources we have for enslaved people's so-called occupations or the particular jobs they did are these registers of enslaved people from the early 19th century British Caribbean. And if you look at the way people are listed in terms of what roles they played, women are almost never recorded as drivers. But I knew from other sources that there actually were a significant number of women drivers, which you could only see by triangulating different types of evidence. I would, for example, be reading about a female driver in a missionary's journal, and I'd go to look her up in the registers to try to learn more about her, where she might have been born, what family connection she had, only to find that there she would be recorded as a field laborer. So there's a kind of archival erasure, which I think has led a lot of historians to underestimate the presence of women drivers. I want to highlight two things. One, these women who were, despite planners' gendered ideology, their bias against using women for specialized and supervisory work, sometimes they were doing just that, which seems a pretty clear recognition that women indeed could do this sort of work. Much more commonly, though, the women who worked as drivers supervised those children's gangs I mentioned earlier. These were children who performed comparatively light work like weeding or spreading manure to fertilize crops. This was a really gendered role, primarily occupied by enslaved women. And I think one of the most disturbing things about it is their job was less to extract labor from these children. I mean, it did certainly contribute to the productivity of the plantation, but their primary job, at least as planners saw it, was essentially to acculturate children to the intensity of field labor under the driving system. It was a sort of perverse apprenticeship into slavery. And planners talked about it as essentially a nursery school for enslaved children, where they molded children into enslaved labor, teaching them what it meant. Part of that was learning how to do the actual agricultural labor involved, but part of that was learning that failing to follow orders, failing to show up on time, led to violence. They talked about these enslaved women needing to have, a twig or a stick or a small whip to flog these children, which, deeply disturbing to read and write about.
I am curious about the violence of slavery because it seemed like drivers had to navigate violence and its infliction in order to push their enslaved workforce as hard as they could. And to push them hard, drivers needed to be able to apply violent means when they had to. So how are drivers able to live with themselves after they inflicted violent means on the bodies and minds of their fellow enslaved people?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And drivers found that aspect of their job to be deeply troubling. The problem for them, of course, is that they were working in a system where they didn't have a lot of other tools at their disposal. It's not like they could offer what we think of as positive incentives or pay people under them to try to get work out. Enslavers gave them basically crude tools and demanded them to use violence and terror to try to keep other people in line and extract labor. When drivers talked about the violence that they inflicted on their fellow enslaved laborers, they often justified it by essentially pointing out that they had no real choice. One of the best known examples of this, at least that comes to mind for me, is Solomon Northup, who listeners might know from 12 Years a Slave, which actually doesn't talk about his role as a driver, but that's a different story. Northup explains in his memoir that when he carried his whip into the field on the Louisiana sugar plantation where he was a driver, he knew that he had to use it and be seen using it, or otherwise, at the end of the day, he was going to be flogged himself. And other drivers said the same thing, and I saw this time and time again, cases where drivers, for whatever reason, couldn't bring themselves to inflict a particular act of violence, to carry out a punishment, to be quite as brutal as their enslavers demanded, and then they wound up tortured themselves, sometimes even demoted. But even knowing this, drivers still found it really hard to live with the violence they inflicted. I remember one incident where a driver in Antigua named Harry went to church service one day with his wife and other enslaved people, and he begged his fellow Christians to forgive him. He said it was awful to have to whip his fellow slaves, especially, he pointed out, his own wife and his own sister. But at the end of the day, he felt like he couldn't disobey the orders of his enslavers. And so here is one of the ways that the driving system obviously damaged field laborers, but also deeply damaged drivers themselves.
I can't even imagine. And as you note in the driver's story, drivers' existence was constantly on the knife's edge as they tried to navigate between violence and inflicting it on people they counted as friends and community members. So it really seems like drivers were stuck between a rock and a hard place, and that must have been incredibly difficult.
Yeah, they've got the impossible job of trying to satisfy people who are at war, right? Or at least to be seen as trying to look out for the interests both of their enslavers and the enslaved people below them. And so it's this constant balancing act where they're choosing from a range of bad options and having to kind of decide which side of that struggle they're going to come down on really throughout every individual day, with deadly consequences for going too far on one side or the other. They can't just crack down on enslaved laborers. They end up facing resistance, sometimes even killed by enslaved people. They can't just try to negotiate for the enslaved people below them and be a community leader, right? Because they're going to lose their job.
One idea that I think our conversation really highlights is the fact that enslaved people influenced the way that slavery was practiced and applied on plantations. Randy, could you give us a real visual example of this? Could you tell us about the African custom of big men and how this custom informed the driving system?
So the term big man was used in Africa and the diaspora during the era of the slave trade, and even today, to refer to male leaders who sought wealth, power, and status, not through the accumulation of land or other forms of material wealth or capital, but largely by claiming large numbers of what we can call, as a catch-all term, followers. And this included, but not only, wives and children. The idea of big man politics and the related idea of what's often called wealth in people helped me understand drivers' social role within enslaved communities, which were, as you point out, largely African. These were people who were African-born themselves, or maybe a generation or two removed from their African homelands. And I found that drivers saw themselves and were seen by other enslaved people, not just in terms of their official role as planner appointed enforcers of discipline, but as leaders within the slave community. One of the basic qualifications for being a driver in the first place, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, was having recognized authority within the slave community already. And what I found is that once someone became a driver, one of the things they did with that position was to try to further enhance their own power and status by cultivating relationships with other enslaved people they wanted to have as followers, and by trying to build families. There are all kinds of ways that drivers did this. They took a calculated risk to try to show other enslaved people that they were trying to help them solve basic problems. Everything from negotiating with white plantation authorities to get a bit more food when people were starving, or reaching out to spiritual healers who might be able to help them figure out the underlying cause of an epidemic disease, or serving as kind of unofficial judiciaries to investigate crimes, like who might be stealing property within the slave community. At the same time, drivers used their status, their marginal material advantages to seek out relationships with enslaved women and build families. And as I think I mentioned earlier, unusually successful in doing this. They're more likely than other enslaved men to be married. They have larger numbers of children, and they're probably the only enslaved men in any particular community who had multiple wives. And so taken together, these were all different ways that drivers aspired to become big men, despite the constraints of doing so in a vastly different world than they would have lived in West or Central Africa. And for me, looking at this role helped me understand how drivers saw the position as a way to create a meaningful social role, not just to carry out their enslavers' orders, and not just to survive.
Did drivers have to be big men before they were drivers? You mentioned that white enslavers looked for people who already had high social standing within the enslaved community, and that was what they looked for before they selected a driver. So did drivers have to be big men first, or did they become big men only after they became a driver?
Yeah, it's a chicken and an egg question with the same difficulty of answering it. I think in general, the most successful drivers were already recognized as big men. You certainly see some drivers who are appointed and don't serve all that long. They don't stay in the role all that long and get demoted fairly quickly. And there are different paths to demotion. But I think one common thread I saw in drivers who were demoted pretty quickly is that they could not get the enslaved people below them to follow their orders. And drivers can't just rely on violence. We talked about that earlier, but your successful drivers had to get some begrudging loyalty and cooperation from the people below them. And the way they did that was by trying to show enslaved people that, hey, we really are looking out for your interests as well. We're not just going to try to arbitrarily inflict violence indiscriminately on everybody. So I guess if I had to come down on one side of it, I think to be appointed as a driver probably did require that you were already some version of a big man beforehand.
As I read the driver's story, my brain kept drawing references to Machiavelli's The Prince, where Machiavelli attempted to train young rulers by asking them, is it better to rule through fear or better to rule through love? And it seems that part of this knife's edge that we've been talking about is that drivers had to balance their need to be community leaders and to be seen as doing well by their community, but they also needed to be able to be brutal to get the labor they needed out of their community so that the drivers didn't get beaten or lose their jobs or endanger their families by losing those material benefits that came with being a driver.
Absolutely. And what you're pointing out is this unresolvable tension between trying to be both a driver and a big man. That, at the end of the day, is an impossible balance to strike, and drivers can never fully resolve that. And instead, their job forces them to live with that tension and to try to convince both groups that they are looking out for their interests, that, oh, no, we're really with the enslavers. No, we really are with the enslaved people. And the reality is they're not. They're primarily looking out for their own interests, and that requires them to try to play both sides.
I think it would be helpful for us to see this tension at play. And I think we can do that in the story of the driver January and his plantation manager Boaz. So would you tell us about January and Boaz and their disagreements as they work together on a Berbice coffee plantation?
There are two key incidents to January's story, a decade apart. The first is an incident in 1819 that got January demoted. At that time, there's this massive epidemic on the plantation. In unusually high numbers, people are getting sick and people are dying. And January decides to reach out to a practitioner of obeah. This is a catch-all term for a variety of what were by then illegal spiritual healing and divination practices. It seems like other enslaved people on the plantation saw this as January sticking his neck out to try to help them solve a problem, an example of essentially trying to be a big man, right, and provide access to healthcare when white plantation authorities were either oblivious or indifferent. But since obeah was illegal, when white authorities found out what was going on, they saw January as defiant. They prosecuted him through the colony's legal system. January's branded, he's whipped, he's tortured, and he's demoted. He loses his job as a driver. So the interesting thing here is the other enslaved people on the plantation, though, it's not just January who is bitter about having been demoted for what he sees as having done nothing wrong. He's actually trying to preserve the lives of the plantation's workforce. Other enslaved people as well seem to respond to January with gratitude and loyalty. And so over the next 10 years, there are these small moments where January is really lashing out at Boaz, who is the overseer, who he held directly responsible for having lost his title and his role and all the benefits that came with it. He's telling enslaved people, hey, don't use Mr. when you're referring to Boaz, right? The honorific, just call him Boaz. At one point, he points to the burial ground on the plantation and tells Boaz in front of other white plantation authorities, hey, you're going to end up there soon enough, right? The most thinly veiled of threats. And this enmity between these two guys explodes 10 years later when a new resident owner arrives. And January stages this massive confrontation. He leads the whole slave population, this is some 200 people on the estate, to the owner's house, ostensibly to ask for a customary dram of rum to welcome him, but really to try to show him that he's the one who's in charge. And this enrages and shocks Boaz because, as he points out when he rushes to confront him, hey, you're not a driver. And January doubles down and says, yeah, but you're just a manager. You're not an owner. Is the rum yours? Can you buy me? Are you really my master? And what happens is this huge riot. Boaz is essentially powerless to get anybody to drag January away. Everybody is really putting their life on the line to protect him and say, no, if you're going to take him and lock him up, you have to lock all of us up. And essentially takes several days to try to resolve this riot that almost turns into a rebellion. And so for me, January's story illustrates two key things. First, that demoting this kind of driver with broad support from below could be incredibly dangerous for white plantation authorities because they couldn't control that kind of authority. And second, that a lot of drivers succeeded way more than their enslavers wanted them to when it came to earning other enslaved people's respect and trust. And so it's an opportunity to see how drivers' power came not just or even primarily from above, from official appointment, but from below.
One of the things that I wondered as I read the driver's story is, why didn't more drivers start rebellions? And then I read your last chapter, which is about the Berbice Rebellion of 1813-1814, and realized that starting a rebellion was a really complicated proposition. So would you tell us about the Berbice Rebellion and about the complexities we can see for drivers if they were to offer and promote this form of resistance?
There were all kinds of ways drivers resisted in smaller, maybe less dramatic, less public ways, right? Turning a blind eye to enslaved people who, say needed to leave the field to nurse children during the day, encouraging work slowdowns or sabotage. But you're right, the most dramatic, kind of egregious example is rebellion, where drivers are doing the exact opposite of what their enslavers expected them to do, right? Undermining the very system of plantation slavery. This 1813-14 rebellion was a conspiracy involving a few hundred, maybe a few thousand enslaved people on about 24 plantations in Berbice who planned to overthrow the colony's white authorities. And what drew me to this rebellion were the really crucial and conflicting roles that drivers played in it. There's three basic ways that drivers played important roles here. First, as with other rebellions throughout the Americas, some of the main organizers of this rebellion were drivers who planned the rebellion alongside other male leaders of diasporic African national groups. At the same time, other drivers played the key role in undermining the rebellion, telling white authorities about the rebel plot right before the rebels could attack, and so they're whistleblowers. And finally, many drivers, like most enslaved people during the rebellion, when confronted with a revolt in the making, did have to make these calculated decisions. Should I join? Should I betray the rebellion? And ultimately, what they decided was to try to stay out of the fray, to try to dodge the rebellion. And so this was an opportunity to see what rebellion meant for drivers and what drivers meant for rebellion. One of the most interesting things I found when I looked at the political aspirations of the drivers who did lead this rebellion, or their vision of what freedom was going to look like, was that they wanted very different things than ordinary enslaved people. Instead of liberating everyone and abolishing the plantation system, the drivers here simply wanted to overthrow white authorities and then run those plantations themselves alongside other elite men, or men who served as officers in these African nations. These drivers imagined a world where a lot of the hierarchies of the plantation system would continue. They would be on top, while the people that they referred to as the so-called low class of people, field laborers, would work directly for them. Now, understandably, most enslaved people weren't willing to risk their lives for this kind of revolution. And so for me, looking at drivers in this rebellion and what they wanted to get out of it, it deepened my understanding of just how hard it was to build the kind of solidarities and support you needed to wage a successful war against slavery. Of course, if you wanted to organize a rebellion, drivers were some of the best positioned people to do that, who had the skill, who had the mobility, who could command other people. But there's a problem when their goals conflicted with those of ordinary enslaved people.
This is likely an unfair observation, but as I read about the Berbice Rebellion, I couldn't help thinking that the drivers' ideas of keeping the same hierarchy that they had experienced in slavery seemed really limited. And I also wondered to what extent this limitation was really due to the example of the Haitian Revolution, where after that revolution, the hierarchical system imposed by slavery took on a similar form in the Free Haitian Society.
You're right to zoom us out from this particular rebellion, because I think you do see the same basic dynamic elsewhere. You do see it in the Haitian Revolution, where there is this huge tension between what, on the one hand, elites wanted out of a revolution. They certainly wanted that to improve their own lives. They wanted freedom for themselves, but they're not trying to create an egalitarian or democratic social order. They're not trying to end plantation production. You see that even earlier in the huge 1763 rebellion in Berbice, where there's this clear division between what's really an elite male dominated rebellion, and then the ordinary, the massive enslaved people who try to stay out of it because they frankly don't see it as serving their own interests. I mean, everybody could agree that overthrowing white enslavers is a good idea. The question is, well, what comes next? How is society organized? Who's in charge? What are the relationships between laborers and the people above them, if any?
And these were really questions that we see being grappled with throughout the age of revolutions that came after the American Revolution.
Yes, yes.
Randy, at the outset of the driver's story, you mentioned that studying drivers offers us a very intimate view of slavery. Would you tell us why that is and how you think this intimate view that you've painted for us in your book, The Driver's Story, adds to our knowledge about slavery in the Atlantic world?
So over the past few decades, really, I think there have been two basic approaches to the study of Atlantic slavery, to kind of grossly oversimplify a really complex and dynamic field. On the one hand, there's been a lot of work that has emphasized the overwhelming power of enslavers and of the institution itself, including the ways that slavery and the slave trade commodified human beings and extracted and concentrated enormous wealth. On the other hand, a lot of scholarship is focused on the many ways that enslaved people resisted their enslavers, or at least fought to carve out some small measure of control over their lives. And what I've tried to do with this book is bring these two approaches, which are not always in dialogue with each other, together by looking at the driving system and drivers. For me, understanding the driver's world and the struggles they faced lets us see how these strategies of coercion and strategies of subversion developed in response to one another, and not as abstractions, but in the messy, often violent, everyday interactions between actual human beings. As much as I've learned a lot about the kind of overall system of plantation management, what's really struck with me as I've worked on this book and in the months and years since finishing it are the personal stories that I found in my research. The driver beaten by a manager in the middle of the field for not getting his gang to work hard enough. The woman who organized a work slowdown and then physically fought the drivers who tried to subdue her. The driver who led a delegation to the protector's office in a hopeless bid to get a especially sadistic manager fired. The driver who murdered his owner for having raped the driver's wife. The demoted driver who was so humiliated that he took his own life, leaving his family alone. Or the head driver who led his Congo nation in revolt against his enslavers. And so I've tried throughout this book to connect these larger dynamics of the Atlantic system to the everyday struggles of actual people trying to survive, to try to paint a human history of the driving system.
Now, did you ever find an answer to your question of how enslavers managed to extract so much labor from the people they enslaved in the face of their resistance? Was it because enslavers helped to create adversarial relationships through the driver system?
The short answer is the driving system, but that's not really an answer because the driving system is so fragile, it's so chaotic, it's constantly under attack. This is not a particularly effective system, but in the end, it's very resilient. And I had to struggle with exactly how the driving system endured so many threats against it and so many attacks, and how the slave system itself survived for so long. I mean, I think that's still a basic question historians are grappling with. And one reason the driving system, I think, worked for enslavers is that it encouraged enslaved people to see themselves as adversaries. It encouraged drivers and the people below them to not form common cause. And so then as now, one of the ways that capitalism functioned was essentially to encourage people to see themselves really as opponents rather than as potential allies against these larger forces. There's certainly exceptions to that rule, but I think that's largely how enslavers wanted the driving system to work, and it's one of the kind of most insidious things that it did.
Now it's time for us to move into our segment, 1776 in Context. So now that we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, in your opinion, Randy, how do you think your research helps us better understand the American Revolution and its broader impact?
I think it's important to see the American Revolution and to see early North America more broadly as part of a much wider Atlantic world, what Karen Wolfe has called vast early America. As a historian of slavery, I'd make a pitch for not only putting slavery at the center of the story of the Revolution, as a lot of historians have been doing for quite some time, but even more broadly of looking at freedom struggles and at rebellions way beyond the colonies that became the United States and beyond the people we normally think of as the main characters in the American Revolution. For me, one advantage of broadening that frame out is that we can see just how differently different groups of people thought about some of these basic questions and debates at the heart of the Age of Revolution, about what freedom and autonomy meant, about who should be in charge, about how men and women should relate to one another, and about what kinds of violence or sacrifices could be justified in the name of revolution.
Randy, now that you've completed the driver's story, what aspect of slavery in the Atlantic world are you researching and writing about?
Oh, probably too many things at the same time, to be honest, but I can tell you about one project that started to take shape, at least the kernel of an idea for it, while I was finishing this book. And it's that chapter on rebellion that we mentioned a couple minutes ago. While I was working on that, one of the things I found that was really surprising was a series of connections between different rebellions and conspiracies in Guyana over more than half a century. It seems pretty clear that enslaved people there remembered what, to me at least, were surprisingly specific details about previous rebellions, previous rebel leaders, about what happened, what went wrong, about lessons they could take from earlier struggles. Some of those connections and memories did make it into the book, like how enslaved people in 1813 remembered the 1763 rebellion, right? So 60 years later, they're taking lessons from this earlier struggle when they're trying to decide how they're going to respond to this rebellion in the making. But I found a lot more of those, and I want to look at that thread, see how these collective memories of resistance to slavery shaped enslaved people's political imagination and what particular lessons they took from the struggles of previous generations.
What if we have more questions about the experiences of drivers or the driving system? Where's the best place for us to get in touch with you?
Oh, I'm always happy to hear from readers. Probably the easiest way to contact me is via my website. That's randymBrown.com. There's a form on there. Sends me an email. Really happy to talk to anyone who's got questions.
And that's Randy M. Brown with an E on the end of Brown.
Yes, thank you. Randy M. Brown with an E.
Well, Randy M. Brown, thank you for joining us and for helping us better understand the system and business of slavery through the driver's system.
Liz, it was my pleasure. I enjoyed our conversation. Thanks so much.
Our conversation with Randy revealed that slavery wasn't simply a top-down system of control. It was a deeply human institution that was shaped by everyday decisions, resistances, and the relationships of the enslaved. Within the plantation system, drivers occupied a uniquely fraught space. They were victims of slavery's violence, and also, at times, its agents. Now, drivers tended to live longer than other enslaved people because their position afforded them access to more food, better clothing, and opportunities to build and support families. But their survival always came with a great moral and emotional cost. As Randy showed us, the position of drivers reveals the brutal efficiency of the plantation labor system. But it also reveals to us something deeper about the humanity of the enslaved. By examining the driver system, we're able to see the need of the enslaved people to survive, to build community, to protect their loved ones, and to find meaning in impossible circumstances. This is the difficult but necessary work of history, to hold space for contradiction, complexity, and truth. Even within the most violent systems of human invention, we'll find individuals who struggled, who adapted, who resisted, and always who mattered. Look for more information about Randy, his book, The Driver's Story, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. BenFranklin'sWorld.com/418. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it and help us grow our community. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what surprised you most about the driver system? Was it the reliance that enslavers had on drivers, the resilience and the resistance that enslaved people showed, or was it something else? I'd love to hear what caught your attention, so let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com.